Great. Thank you so much for that introduction, Robin, and thank you to RAPS for allowing us to present this webinar in partnership with them, and welcome to our audience. I'd like to introduce our speaker for today, Ms. Gabriella Mangino. Gabby is currently a product manager at Certara, where she has years of patient narrative production and project lead experience in the pharmaceutical industry. In her role, Gabby works with commercial and services groups to help develop and improve the software that supports our technology-enabled authoring capabilities. Gabby, welcome to the webinar. I'll now turn it over to you to begin the presentation.
All right. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining today and taking time out of your busy schedules. As Suzanne mentioned, I'm product manager here at Certara Synchrogenics, and I work with various internal groups, software, commercial services to assure the success of our regulatory technology solutions for medical writing. So we find it very important to develop technology solutions, whether it be internal tools or external softwares that we can offer to sponsors to support all of our medical writing needs. So transparency and disclosure requirements actually fall within this realm as well. So today I'll be presenting on a very relevant kind of topic within the medical writing community, which is kind of smarter clinical document automation now for T&D requirements later on. So what does that mean? Preparing your documents for submission with kind of transparency and disclosure requirements in mind. So what is transparency and disclosure? What does it mean? Some of us may be totally new to this idea, and some of us may be a little bit more established in this workflow, but transparency and disclosure within the realm of medical writing is disclosing, in this case, clinical data to the public or other regulatory agencies post-submission. So what do these regulations look like? And again, a lot of these you might be familiar with. First and foremost, European Medicine Agency, EMA's, Policy 70 and Policy 43. So Policy 70 requires sponsors to publish anonymized versions of clinical study reports and submission documents submitted in support of marketing authorization applications. So this really began in 2015. So it's been around for a few years, and kind of off of the coattails of Policy 70 is Policy 43. Which required documents that companies at first assumed were submitted on a confidential basis. Those documents now need to be made publicly available to citizens of the EU. So submitting these applications and making that clinical data transparent and disclosing it. Similar to EMA's transparency and disclosure requirements, we have Health Canada's. And you might hear of the public release of clinical information, PRCI, which is relatively newer, essentially making anonymized clinical information in drug submissions and medical device applications publicly available. So disclosing all of this information. Of course, we have other agencies like FDA and others who have similar transparency and disclosure requirements. The impact. Here comes the need to redact or anonymize data within these clinical documents. And first and foremost, we might be thinking of personal protected data, known as PPD. You might hear PPI as well. So this really involves redacting information, which is, you might hear black boxing information. This is essentially just concealing information within a document with a black box so that it can't be read in that particular document, or anonymizing it. Anonymization is really focusing on data utility. How can we keep data fields within a document and apply some sort of transformation to that data field? So in this example shown, participant 1230085 is now shuffled to the ID of 1230223. So here's a look at that application across a patient narrative kind of introduction sentence for an adverse event. What we've done here is we've transformed that data field. We've anonymized that date into a new date, likely offset, and we've kind of black boxed or redacted that pregnancy event term. Aside from PPD, we also have to focus on the redaction of company or commercially confidential information, CCI. This is oftentimes determined by the sponsor. It's unique to every company, and it's an example of CCI would be a signature. So we have a request to redact information, anonymize information, meet some sort of transparency and disclosure requirement. What does this involve? It involves reworking existing clinical documents post-submission. So we have all these pieces of the puzzle coming together, all of these kind of industry terms, T&D specific terms that we need to think of when we're putting together a submission. So some of these terms include re-identification. Can an individual within that document be re-identified? If a regulator or someone in the public would be reading that information on that patient within a clinical study report, for example. We also have pseudonymization, which is replacing kind of one person's subject ID, for example, with another person's in the study. Just another way of transforming data and making it less identifiable. And of course, we have anonymization, and then this fun report called an anonymization report, which essentially provides a summary of all of the different transformations that we're making to data and other steps or actions we're taking on data within a document to redact it. This report is provided alongside the submission package. With kind of all of these components, we have to think about the risk, which is a probability of re-identifying a trial participant. Of course, smaller studies, more, smaller, more focused therapeutic areas, rare diseases, there's a much higher risk of re-identifying a trial participant. So if there are 10 patients in a study, and we have 10 narratives in the clinical study report, it's going to be a little bit easier to potentially identify patients particular to their summaries or their narratives versus a narrative submission of 1,000 narratives and 1,000 patients. So we have to keep in mind when we're calculating our risk assessment as well as setting our risk threshold. Most commonly is 0.09 on that particular data set for that study. What kind of study that we're covering in that data set? Is it a more rare disease or a more common one? So all of these components are ultimately feeding into this proposed package and final redaction package. So oftentimes in working with EMA or Health Canada, you're able to kind of apply draft anonymizations or redactions across your submission portfolio, submit this in a draft format for Health Canada or EMA to review. They provide any feedback, whether they accept or reject the transformations on data or redacted fields that you're applying to your document, and then you prepare the final package for delivery. Again, this involves reworking existing clinical documents post-submission. So what would it look like to actually manage a submission when you have to go back and apply transparency and disclosure actions on that submission? So redacting and anonymizing. Here is a look at an internal tool that Certara Synchrogenics uses to essentially take previously submitted documents in PDF format and apply transformations to that document. So in looking at this example, this black box indicates fields that have been redacted within that particular document. This entire document is only 11 pages, and I say only because we know how kind of large CSRs can get, protocols, statistical analysis plans, and things like that. They can become very large documents. And as you can see, you have to go through and review every page. Of course, every page isn't going to contain PPD or CCI, but you do need to review the entire submission document comprehensively and identify the fields to make transformations on. In speaking to anonymized data, when we apply anonymized data to a previously submitted document, What we're essentially doing is creating keys, which are going through and identifying a particular data field for a patient, taking that old value, applying a transformation to it, and creating a new value. So in these examples shown here, we have the end date for adverse events. We see the old value and a new value based on either an offset or another kind of date transformation rule that we could apply to that date set. Same most commonly with age, we're applying some sort of age band. So if a patient is 43, for example, instead within that anonymized data field in the document, we will see patient of age 40 to 50. So anonymized data is really commonly applied to your demographic fields within your data set and within your documents. So these are things like subject ID, age, race, sex, ethnicity, maybe country, and can also extend to all of the dates within your data set. So it's a little bit more expansive, definitely has an impact on the level of effort and transformations kind of required across the document if you're offsetting all of your dates specific to patients. Problems with rework. I hope that you see I've been suggesting there are some areas that will really give you trouble and create for a very kind of tedious, labor-intensive process for applying anonymizations and redactions to a document. So first and foremost, as I mentioned, we're working with submission PDFs. So when you receive a request from EMA or Health Canada, or you're just getting ahead of meeting your T&D requirements, you'll have to be pulling from your submission PDFs. You're not pulling from a Word format of a document, in draft version. You're pulling from that PDF with bookmarks that was included in the original submission. There are sometimes some formatting inconsistencies or some other hidden characters within PDFs that we don't see. That can affect a tool or software's ability to recognize those fields as data fields and be able to apply anonymizations or redactions to them. And there could be some other issues with PDFs as well when you're working on these documents within a tool. It's making sure that a tool can actually read a PDF appropriately. Costly. So this is a downstream effort that right now in standard industry practice is considered an additional step, an added step, a completely different workflow process aside from initial medical writing. So if you want to think of it in terms, the easiest terms as possible, it's medical writing times 2. So depending on which vendor that you're working with and how your contracts are set up, or if you're doing it internally, in-house, you may be charged a per page fee for processing. So if you have 100,000 pages in your submission that need to be reviewed for redactions or anonymizations, and let's say each page costs $5 for that particular vendor, that's very costly. And that could be a cost that could include a manual review as well as assistance from a tool or a software. And if it's not a per page fee, it could be maybe hourly rates, and thinking about kind of the human effort of reviewing a page top to bottom, reading an entire page, reading an entire narrative, reading an entire listing, that is very timely. So there's definitely a high cost associated with taking documents past submission and reworking them for T&D requirements. Timely. As I mentioned, whether you're working with a tool or software, or you're working with a small or large team of transparency specialists or other individuals that are focused exclusively on this transparency and disclosure work, it's still timely. It's going back and reviewing your submission documents from start to end, again, and ensuring that you're capturing all the appropriate data fields you need to. And speaking from Certara Synchrogenics experience of our services team, Health Canada and EMA really perform a thorough review. They're looking at every page, they're identifying inconsistencies, they're checking that the work that you're saying that you're doing to transform data per the anonymization report is actually being applied within your documents. So they are checking, very closely at things like, if you are shuffling patient IDs, does every patient have one shuffled ID? If a patient appears across multiple documents in the submission, do they have that same shuffled ID across multiple documents? So it can be very tricky to ensure consistencies across documents like that. And it's also important to keep in mind that Health Canada and EMA perform a very tedious, in-depth review of all submissions. So this isn't work that you can rush. You can definitely use a tool or software to help you save on some of the time and costs, but you definitely can't cut any corners. So in speaking more closely to timeline as well, depending if you're submitting to Health Canada or EMA, there are special kind of timelines. You have 90 days, you have 6 months, you have a year from submission decision to submit your documents. So the amount of time that it takes for your organization to manually perform or kind of feed documents into a software, perhaps it's not compatible with the true time that you're given. Of course, we see as medical writers, we're kind of always against the clock with writing time and meeting deadlines for submission. So this certainly isn't, a quick process that can be done in a short amount of time, unless you're dealing with a very, very small submission, but that's not commonly the case. We've seen time and time again, if a sponsor is receiving kind of an urgent request from Health Canada, for example, they're given a week, 2 weeks, maybe less time to go through 50,000 pages and perform redactions and anonymizations. So this takes time. And with all this time, again, as I mentioned, it's tedious work. It's work that needs to be performed manually. Checking each page. And this is especially important when dealing with PDFs, when there are signatures or perhaps there are scanned pages in the form of PDFs. A lot of the time, tools or external software that utilize artificial intelligence or machine learning, they're not going to pick up those fields. They're not going to recognize those fields because they are handwritten fields or they're scanned pages. And it's not going to be picked up in an automated manner. That's where kind of the manual review effort by someone on your team is absolutely necessary. And I keep speaking to a team under the assumption that every organization has a transparency and disclosure team in place, which is not always the case. It's a relatively kind of niche area of focus within the submission process. It could fall within the safety team. It could fall within the medical writing team. It could fall with technical editors. It's a very specialized task that those who perform it need to be first and foremost familiar with the regulations. And they also need to have kind of the time and availability to handle a large submission size, as I mentioned, hundreds, maybe thousands of pages at a time. So how can we write smarter? We always want to think of ways to do our jobs more efficiently. I speak to technology as kind of feeding into our ability to get things done in a more timely manner, but of course, increase the quality of the work that we're producing. But we also want to integrate all of these kind of ideas behind transparency and disclosure, what fields we need to look out for, and how can we actually write now in preparing for our initial submission documents with transparency and disclosure in mind later. So this is actually something that kind of various industry leaders and authors in the space have written works too, books about. And it's something that's not necessarily practiced yet enough, but it is very important to implement in workflows kind of moving forward. Now that we do have more robust technology in place to support our efforts. So medical writing efforts should always have T&D in mind. So there are a few different ways that we can look at this sync between medical writing and transparency and disclosure requirements, as well as kind of grouping teams together, working together with these ideas in mind from the very start. So we want to think of writing as kind of a transparency-friendly effort right from the start. So what can we do when it comes to approaching PPD? So PPD is something, patient information, that's going to kind of occur commonly across your clinical study reports, for example. You might not find PPD in your SAP or your protocol, but it is kind of widely spread across clinical documents. And there are ways that you can kind of approach including PPD throughout your documents in smarter ways that make it easier to redact or anonymize that PPD later. So first and foremost, we want to reduce or eliminate gender-specific pronoun references. And this is kind of practiced more commonly in the industry, where we're saying the subject, the participant, the patient, over and over again, instead of he and she. And that's extremely important, because every instance of he or she and male and female within a document, if appropriate, when trying to meet your risk threshold, that's something that you would be redacting or anonymizing or generalizing throughout your document. So all of those instances, you would need to find those instances and go back and make a transformation to them. So what you can do upstream while you're writing your clinical study reports and your patient narratives, for example, is eliminate gender-specific pronouns entirely. You can also reduce or eliminate the mention of dates and instead mention study days. Of course, this is avoiding that very kind of tedious, very extensive effort of anonymizing all dates in a document, which is tricky to kind of tie back to individual patients if the same date occurs more than once within your submission document. Kind of a quick fix that doesn't impact kind of the quality of the clinical study report or your patient narratives, instead mentioning study days and not dates. This is a little nitpicky item, but is actually very important when you're using a technology or software, or if you're performing the work manually. You want to ensure that dates do not break across more than one line of text if you are using them in your patient narratives, for example. That's going to be a trickier field for your software to recognize as a date if it does break across. It's not a very good practice in medical writing to have a date break across a line like that. But that's just one of those things that if you are using a tool, that entire string, because it breaks across two lines of text, won't be recognized as a date. And thus your tool would miss it. Perhaps your reviewer would miss it as well. And you would have to go back and make sure you catch it. You also want to avoid jamming text in tables in which borders may interfere with banding or replacing text. So when working with PDFs, and specific to patient narratives, we oftentimes have kind of an introduction, demographic information for that patient, and we put it in a nice table, reads very well. But when it comes to actually applying a redaction or anonymization on that particular field during our transparency and disclosure efforts, we see something like this circled in red. So we've applied an age band, we've kind of generalized ethnicity, and now we see female. We've actually retained the gender within this particular submission. But now we see that female push out of the kind of header box there. And because in this case, the technology was not modifying that PDF in any way, right? It's not reformatting that PDF. That female is kind of stuck across the border like that. So you have to think about ways in which you can build out tables or other fields within your template that couldn't potentially cause an issue when you are banding or you are creating transformations of data for T&D. And last but not least, we want to generalize country as well. This is one of those fields that is often, we need to generalize when we are performing, anonymizations on a document. You want to just generalize country from the start within your patient narratives as you're writing your initial submission. All right, so how can we use automation or technology to not only assist with medical writing, but also assist with assuring T&D success down the road? So I mentioned patient safety narratives a few times, and this is going to kind of be our case study in an example that I'm going to demo shortly, just because patient safety narratives have a great chunk of that PPD that we're trying to redact or anonymize within documents. Whenever we're writing patient safety narratives or even efficacy narratives, we want to use a transparency-friendly template. And those templates kind of keep in mind some of the things I highlighted on the last slide, with making sure your dates don't break across a page, making sure that all of your demographic information, your dates are laid out in a very clear manner that would allow for a transformation or a box to be applied over that data field. Here's a fun idea. Let's automate your template using your clinical or SCTM or ADAMS data. SCTM and ADAMS data, clinical data set, is the data set that you're working with to anonymize your data in your submission. So in the products we support in the past for sponsors, they provide us the data set. This could just be ADSL, which is like an ADAMS data set, summary of demographic information, or it could be the whole breadth of all the STTM data for the study. And they also provide all of the documents that require redaction or anonymization. So what our team would do and what your organization would do is anonymize that data set and feed that data set into the document. So why not just automate a template during the medical writing phase using SCTM or ADAMS data? And again, I'm going to highlight how we can use data and even automated solutions to make T&D efforts much easier down the road. So here's an example of what a template would look like that's actually using the mapping from data fields within the SCTM data set. In this software that I'll demo shortly, these data fields are fed into the template. And you could also feed anonymized data into the template as well. So an easy kind of shortcut. I'll show you there in a little bit. Why aren't we generating an original or non-transformed narrative, for example, and also an anonymized narrative at the same time while we're medical writing? We can't get around our transparency and disclosure requirements. We can't just say, no, we're not going to submit to Health Canada or AMA after we receive submission decision. No, we're just going to ignore their request for T&D requirements. We can't avoid it. So why don't we integrate the production of an anonymized version of that particular clinical document at the start while we're medical writing, while we're in the early phases of writing for our submission? This could save us time, cost down the road. So that supports kind of submitting one now and saving the second one for later, right? You don't want to submit that anonymized version in your initial submission, but you're saving it for later and you don't have to go through all the efforts of reworking that submission, all the costs associated with it, building out a specific transparency and disclosure team to support this work. One question, which I'll address in the demonstration is, are there PPD data fields within a narrative template that we can choose to leave out now so we don't have to anonymize or redact them later? So on the previous slide, I know I mentioned you could leave out gender, and I'll show you a few other fields you can leave out as well. All right, so we're coming up to the fun part, which is actually showing how we can write smarter now for our transparency and disclosure requirements later. So we're going to use data to kind of automate our patient safety narrative templates that are T&D friendly. So let's take a look into our software for transparency and disclosure. Right now, Synchrogenix Writer is a software that we use on our patient narratives, and it has a great kind of implication and carry over into the transparency and disclosure space. Let me go ahead and share this portal. All right, and let's take a look at a few different examples of templates. So we're going to start with kind of our original data and our original narrative template before we're kind of proposing making any edits to it to make that template more T&D friendly. So here I am in my web-based application, Synchrogenix Writer, and I have my narrative template set up. And I'll walk you through kind of the demographic introductory portion of a patient narrative. So let's take a look at the original narrative template using the original data set for the particular study. So I'm on my original subject list, all my patients that meet criteria for writing these narratives. And I'm going to select my subject here and preview that data for that particular subject. So within Synchrogenix Writer, what I've done is I've kind of drag and dropped in my data fields from my clinical data, SCTM data that I've uploaded to this project. And I've mapped out my template section for kicking off kind of the narrative summary portion of the templates with that data and surrounding template text. So you'll see here in my preview, I have participant ID is a 68-year-old Asian, not Hispanic or Latino female, enrolled in phase 3 study, experiencing cataract, worsening of bilateral cataracts on date and study day. So lots of information, kind of follows your standard or your typical presentation for a patient narrative. So let's take a look at how that particular narrative would look like if I made anonymized transformations on it within kind of real time as I'm writing my document. I'm setting up a new template and I'm working off of a new data set so that I'm retaining my original version, but I'm also producing an anonymized version at the same time. Technology is allowing me to do this. Of course, this would be extremely tedious if I were to be doing this manually. So let's now switch to my anonymized participant list. Let's take a look at my summary section for my anonymized data. And let's look at that same patient. Now I performed a shuffle on the patient ID. So this patient now has a new ID. And for the sake of this demo, I've just switched the two right under each other. So let's look at what this anonymized version would now look like of the same exact narrative, same data set, except we've anonymized it. Now we have the same participant ID. Now we see an age band, 65 to 70-year-old, not Hispanic or Latino, because we want to keep in ethnicity. I have removed reference to race and also sex. And I'm keeping that the patient was enrolled in the study and experienced now eye disorders. So what I've done is I have entirely removed the preferred term and reported term. If you remember, cataract and worsening of bilateral cataracts. And I've removed the date of that event. I've just retained the study day. So here's the kind of transparency and disclosure friendly version of that same narrative. Received a shuffle ID, an age band, kept the generalization of ethnicity, and now we've generalized also the AE term. I believe this is the high level term, or the SOC for that particular event. So while we are producing both the original and the anonymized version of a document, we can also produce some sort of hybrid. And what this is doing is it's keeping the original data, but it's making those template edits that I spoke to earlier that kind of guarantee a more transparency and disclosure friendly template while you're writing. So while it's not necessarily eliminating the need to produce or to carry out those redaction and anonymization efforts downstream, it's kind of lessening the work effort involved in that. So if you do create some sort of hybrid template as shown here, the level of effort may be slightly lesser than using the original template. So in this example, we are keeping age, but we have removed race. Again, we're keeping generalized ethnicity. We are removing sex. We're keeping the event term, but we're removing the event start date and just retaining the event study day. Again, all of this can be achieved at the same time within specifically the Synchrogenics writer software that we offer through Certara, but in other technologies that can kind of feed in that clinical data into the template so that you can kind of do both at the same time. You can be medical writing your initial narratives for submission, and you can also be prepping or preparing the kind of entire submission for your anonymization efforts down the road as well. All right, so let me switch back to my presentation. All right, so what does the future of transparency and disclosure look like? Again, I mentioned it's something that we can't get away from. You know, it's a requirement through various regulatory health agencies. We just need to be thinking about it now instead of later. It has so many impacts to organizations. We've seen kind of teams kind of be in complete chaos when they receive a request from Health Canada or an EMA, and they're trying to prepare these submissions, and they don't know if a tool or technology will be able to help. They can't even conceptualize how large of a team is going to have to be available to carry out these efforts. We want to think about it now, and we want to refine our writing processes. We want kind of every single initial medical writing effort that we are engaging in, we want to be thinking if that the way we're writing, the template we're using, the style guide we're following, is it transparency and disclosure friendly? Of course, we want to work with some sort of automated solution that can produce submission ready documents and T&D required documents down the road. We want to use a technology that's going to help us in the process and make our team's work much more efficient. We hope to see a decreased burden on a specialized team. Maybe there's not a need to create a specialized transparency and disclosure team within an organization. Perhaps it's a sort of hybrid role that medical writers can kind of take on and keep in mind as they're writing first drafts. And that a specialized team does not need to be created with the sole focus on transforming, anonymizing, redacting data fields post-submission. We want various teams to work together. And we want these teams to get a head start on meeting requirements, right? We don't want to be sitting back, not meeting compliance, not kind of meeting requirements. And then we get a request from Health Canada or EMA and we're all panicking, right? And we can actually handle any of these regulatory authority requests, these, off requests that we didn't realize we were in non-compliance with greater confidence. We have a team in place, we have a tool in place, we have those documents already prepared and ready to go, so we can meet the submission deadline. All right, so we're now at kind of the Q&A portion of this demonstration, and I'm excited to hear from all of you if you have any questions or anything that I can further highlight about these ideas. Not sure we can hear you, Suzanne.
Give us a moment while Suzanne unmutes herself.
Is that better?
Yes.
Okay. Yay. All right. Excellent. Okay. So someone wants to know, what do you do about old documents that are already in PDF version?
So that's actually the preference. You need to work with those documents when you're meeting transparency and disclosure requirements. You're not pulling up Word versions of documents. You actually need to work with those PDFs that were already included in the original submission. Many technology vendors, including ourselves, have built out tools and software that work with PDFs. So it's not a matter of the ability of not working with PDFs. It is something that you actually need to do when you revisit those submissions.
Excellent. Gabby, can you tell us what is the most common approach that people take, anonymization or redaction, and how might this choice affect the level of effort that's needed on a document?
Sure. So anonymization and redaction kind of go hand in hand. Often we're seeing a hybrid approach. So there are some fields within documents that you can't get around redacting, things like signatures and CCI. But there is definitely a push towards kind of the greatest data utility possible within a document. And that's where you want to apply anonymization. So thinking about a patient narrative, you have all these PPD fields. You don't want to put black boxes across all of that. That really decreases the data utility within that particular narrative. So there is a great push in all the projects that we're kind of seeing coming through Certara Synchrogenics and our services team. We are following that hybrid model where we are transforming patient IDs and offsetting dates throughout a submission. Is one more difficult than the other? Not necessarily. Of course, the anonymization process requires transforming data and working with that data set before you actually go into the document. But you're reviewing all of the PPD CCI fields just the same. You have to review the documents start to finish and review the submission as a whole.
Excellent. Gabby, someone would like to know, they've got a question about Synchrogenics Writer. Can we use this tool to go back and change a strategy downstream based on feedback from the EMA or Health Canada?
So really, Synchrogenics Writer is one of those softwares that you want to be using for your medical writing efforts from the start. So you want to have your clinical study report written in there. You want to have your patient narratives written in there. And based on the feedback that you are receiving, when you are going and submitting your documents for T&D, you can go in and make any of those edits within Synchrogenics Writer. So thinking about the templates that you have set up for your clinical study report or your patient narratives, if you're seeing that in your submission downstream, you never want to mention gender, you never want to include dates, you want to maybe change the layout of dates or the format of dates. All those things, all those changes can be made to your master templates within Synchrogenics Writer. So you can kind of do that proactively as you receive feedback. And for all of your documentation moving forward, you're making those edits within the software, and you're kind of guaranteeing that those edits, that feedback is applied to all of your submission documents going forward. And they'll probably be better received by Health Canada and EMA when it comes time.
Are health authorities okay with sponsors redacting race or narrative from, race or sex from narratives and other substantive information that might affect the interpretation of the narrative?
Yes, so actually we see it's very common that sex is something that you do want to redact, especially as it relates to kind of gender-specific concomitant medications or adverse events that the patient experiences, right? If I'm reading a patient narrative where the person was taking birth control and they have a pregnancy and things like that, of course, that's going to reveal that that patient is a female. And if it is something that we're trying to mask gender across the entire submission, we need to ensure that we are redacting all fields that would identify that patient as a female. So it is the sex within the demographic summary portion, and it is any ConMeds, medical history even, and events that relate to sex. So we've been seeing in recent EMA and Health Canada feedback that that is definitely something that is requested, almost required, that we do kind of eliminate gender reference entirely.
Do you have any feedback from the EMA or Health Canada when replacing the patient with an SOC term in the narrative?
So I can't speak to specific feedback that we've received of late surrounding that, but it is something that makes kind of complete sense if we're thinking about the fields that we're including in medical history are some of those like higher level terms. It is important if we are retaining the adverse event term that we do want to do it in a way that's smarter and can speak to under what realm that event falls, and we don't want to necessarily mask it, right? If the information written in the narrative is important and telling, and it makes sense to include some sort of reference to what that event actually is, then we want to keep it in the narrative. We don't want to mask it entirely. We do want to transform it to an SOC or higher level term without kind of jeopardizing the data utility. We're keeping data utility by doing that.
Great. Makes a lot of sense. I think we've addressed all the questions from our audience. So I'd like to thank Gabby for this excellent presentation, and also thank RAPS for allowing us to host this event with them in partnership. And now I'm going to hand it back to Robin to close the event.